There's a version of family continuity that can look solid on paper. The wealth is still in the family. The accounts are still there. The relationship has been there for years. And still, underneath all that, trust may never have really spread beyond one person.
And that's what makes the great wealth transfer such an important test. It's not only about where the wealth goes, it's about whether trust goes with it.
And that's really the deeper issue here. A firm can say it serves the family, but when wealth actually moves to a spouse, to children, to heirs, that's when you find out whether the relationship was really shared or mostly sitting with one person.
This is Advising Humans, where we talk about the human side of advice, especially the part that doesn't always get said out loud. And in this episode, we're looking at why the great wealth transfer is not just about demographics or estate planning. It's a real test of whether firms have built relationships that can actually stay strong when wealth moves.
Because the money may move, but the relationship may not.
And the scale of this is so big that firms really can't afford to treat it casually. Cerulli Associates estimates that about $124 trillion will transfer through 2048, with roughly $105 trillion going to heirs and about $18 trillion going to charity.
And it doesn't even move in one clean direction.
No, it doesn't, and that's one of the most important parts of this. A lot of people think only about wealth moving to children, but Cerulli says a huge amount moves first to surviving spouses, about $54 trillion, with nearly $40 trillion going to widowed women in older generations.
And that's where a lot of firms are more exposed than they think.
It is, because if the advisor built most of the real relationship with just one person, then the transfer to the surviving spouse is not just about assets. It's a loyalty test. Cerulli's 2024 research on widows and widowers found that 85% stayed with the incumbent advisor overall, with men at 91% and women at 81%. And that gap suggests the relationship is often much stronger with one spouse than the other, even in households that looked stable from the outside.
Yes, and that gets right to it. Shared paperwork is not the same as shared trust.
It really isn't. And this is where the weakness starts to cost something. Because if the spouse was present, but not truly known, then the firm is asking for continuity at the very moment when the relationship feels least established from that person's side.
And that's such a human problem before it ever becomes a business problem.
Totally. Someone may be grieving, disoriented, or just suddenly realizing the relationship they thought they had was actually their spouse's relationship. That feels very different from, this advisor knows me too.
And then eventually the money moves vertically.
Right, and the next generation piece is just as important, maybe even more dangerous over time. Cerulli's 2025 research found that only 27% of people expecting an inheritance say they'd keep the managing advisor, and that drops to 20% among those who already inherited. Cerulli's 2023 research also found that only 19% of affluent investors use their parents' advisor. That's a pretty clear sign that wealth often transfers without the relationship coming with it.
So the parents may have had deep trust, but the children often don't inherit that trust at all.
Right, they inherit assets, but they don't automatically inherit the relationship. And that's one of the biggest mistakes firms make. They assume long tenure with the parents means long-term continuity with the family. But if the adult children were treated more like future names on paper than real people in the relationship now, that connection can break the minute the wealth changes hands.
And that makes the great wealth transfer sound a lot less like a growth opportunity and a lot more like a relationship stress test.
That's what it is. A family can still look fully retained on paper, while the future of the relationship is actually pretty fragile. The trust might still be sitting with the parent or the departing advisor or one main household contact. And once that person is gone, retires, dies, or simply stops being the center of the relationship, the weakness becomes visible.
Which is also why this ties back so directly to advisor change.
It does. Advisor change is like an earlier version of the same trust test. And McKinsey's 2025 research gives that a broader business context, reporting that 32% of affluent and high net worth investors switch firms when their advisor leaves for retirement or other reasons. The minute the central relationship shifts, all the weaker connections around it become easier to see. The spouse who was never fully brought in. The adult child who knows the advisor exists but doesn't feel any real relationship. The household that looked stable only because one person was carrying most of the trust.
So wealth transfer and advisor change are connected by the same basic problem.
Yes, if the firm hasn't built real relationships across the household, then every major transition turns into a retention risk, a death, an inheritance, a retirement, an advisor change, a merger. They all reveal the same thing. Was trust actually built across the relationship, or was it sitting mostly in one place?
And that's where the enterprise value part starts to matter.
Very much so, because when trust never really spread far enough, the cost is not just emotional discomfort. It turns into lost assets, weaker family retention, slower growth, and future wealth going elsewhere. And the business case here is real. Even small improvements in retention after a transition can protect meaningful firm value.
So this is not only about protecting the current relationship, it's about protecting the next phase of the relationship too.
Exactly. A lot of the firm's future value depends on whether those future household assets are actually tied to the relationship. And if the spouse or adult children don't feel known, included, or independently comfortable, those future assets are much less secure than the balance sheet makes them look.
So what do better firms do differently?
They stop acting like one strong primary relationship is enough. They build real relationships across the household early. They bring the spouse or partner into the relationship before a crisis forces it. They include adult children where it makes sense. They create family conversations instead of only account conversations. And Cerulli found that 89% of high net worth advisors say proactive family meetings are one of the most effective ways to retain wealth. That makes sense because family continuity has to be built before the transfer moment, not after it.
Because once the transfer moment arrives, you're no longer building from a place of calm.
Right, you're trying to steady something under pressure, and that's always harder than building trust earlier while the relationship still has time and room to grow. And Schwab's 2024 RIA benchmarking study adds another angle. It found that referrals accounted for 67% of new clients and new client assets. So when continuity breaks down, the risk is not just retention. It can also hurt future growth that comes from client confidence and advocacy.
So, if we were putting this into one line, it might be this. The great wealth transfer will expose who the family actually trusts.
I think that's right. Because when wealth moves but trust doesn't, the firm is more exposed than it looks. And the advisors who do this well understand that family continuity is not something you claim. It's something you build, person by person, long before a transition puts pressure on it.
Yeah, and I think that's really the bigger point of this whole conversation. This is not only about inheritance, it's not only about assets changing hands, it's about whether the relationship was ever broad enough, strong enough, and personal enough to hold when life changes.
Right, because the real risk is not just that money leaves, it's that the next person in the family never felt fully connected in the first place. The spouse may have been included but not really known. The children may have been aware of the advisor but never truly in relationship. And then when the transfer happens, the weak spots stop being hidden.
Which means this is really a relationship building issue long before it becomes a retention issue.
It is. And that's why the firms that come through these moments, well, usually are not scrambling at the point of transfer. They've already done the quieter work. They've widened trust across the household. They've made continuity feel real. They've built something bigger than one primary relationship. Because in the end, this is about whether trust was deep enough and wide enough to keep going when life changes.
If this conversation made you think differently about what the great wealth transfer really reveals inside client relationships, share it with another advisor or leader who cares about building trust across the whole family, not just with one primary contact.
And if your team wants a more consistent way to guide advisor change, the Advisor Change Transition Playbook Suite for Advisors gives you shared language, meeting flow, and practical tools to help continuity feel real across spouses, partners, and future generations.
Because when wealth moves, the real question is whether trust moves with it.
Thanks for listening to Advising Humans.
We'll see you next time.